The snow came down like quiet judgment, steady and unrelenting. It blanketed the Montana plains in a hush so complete that even the horses in the paddock stood still, as if listening for something beneath the wind. Eli Thatcher stood on the porch of his cabin, a tin cup of bitter coffee warming his fingers, watching that white drift pile against the steps. He'd built this place 5 winters back, with rough-hewn timber and solitude in mind. Every board told of blisters and silence, and he'd learned to welcome both. The land stretched far and empty around him, 200 acres of pine-shadowed slopes, frozen creek beds, and sorrow tucked in the folds of memory. There wasn't much reason for a man to speak out here, not since the world had taken everything that once made him eager to. A wife, a child, both buried in a fever winter that come too early, like this one. Since then, he spoke mostly to the wind or the mare he called Juniper. He heard the knock before he saw her. It was not the kind of knock a man forgets, urgent but not panicked. 3 firm raps against the frame, as if the knocker had the right but not the will. When he opened the door, the storm flared behind her, casting her in snowlight and shadow. She looked like she might break in half if the wind leaned a little harder. A wool shawl wrapped tight over her shoulders, her hair clung wet to her cheeks. She wasn't young, not exactly, but young enough for the hunger in her eyes to still have edges. "I'm not asking for more than the night," she said, voice thin and cracked from cold. "Just a roof." He said nothing for a moment. He hadn't had a guest in 3 years, but he stepped aside and let her in. She hesitated like someone used to being turned away, then stepped over the threshold without lifting her eyes. Her boots tracked slush across the plank floor. He watched the way her shoulders curved inward, as if trying to make herself smaller than she already was. "I've got stew," he said finally, and gestured toward the stove. She gave a tight nod, still clutching her bundle, one frayed blanket and a worn leather satchel. It looked heavy for its size. Her hands trembled as she pulled off the shawl, revealing a bruise across her cheekbone, fading but still dark. He didn't ask. They ate in silence, the kind that filled the room thick like smoke. She sat on the edge of the chair, never quite resting. When she finished, she said, "Thank you," so soft he barely heard it. He nodded once and fetched another blanket, laying it over the cot near the fire. She watched him with eyes that had forgotten how to trust. "Name's Eli," he said, after a long while. She stared at the flames before answering, "Clara." Outside, the wind scraped against the shutters like a thing trying to get in. Inside, 2 strangers shared a room too small for secrets and too large for comfort. Eli sat back in his rocker, hands wrapped around the same tin cup, now filled with nothing but the memory of warmth. Clara lay down without a word, her back to the room. In the morning, he expected her to be gone. Maybe leave a note, maybe not. That's what folks did, passed through. But when he opened his eyes, he found her in the kitchen corner, tending the stove like it was her own. Something in his chest shifted. Not a wound reopening, not yet, but maybe the start of something else. A seed in the thawing dark. The days after Clara came were marked not by declaration, but by a slow, weathered rhythm. She stayed, not through any spoken agreement, but by motion, rising with the dawn, sweeping ash from the hearth, mending the threadbare linens without being asked. Eli found her in these quiet acts, each one a stitch into the fabric of his solitude. He didn't ask why she stayed, she didn't offer. By the second morning, she was outside before him, splitting kindling with a practiced hand. Her coat was too thin, her gloves mismatched, but she moved with a determination that belonged to someone who'd survived worse than cold. Eli watched from the doorway, coffee in hand, an ache blooming behind his ribs he hadn't named in years. In town, her name hadn't surfaced. He checked, under the guise of needing lamp oil and oats. No one at the mercantile mentioned a missing woman, no posters, no questions. Whatever she ran from, it hadn't come looking yet. Winter thickened around the cabin. Snow pressed high against the eaves, and the wind howled through the pines with a mournful edge. At night, Eli added wood to the fire and watched the shadows dance across the walls. Clara began reading from a worn novel she'd found among his late wife's books, her voice low and even, a balm against the dark. He never asked about the bruise, never mentioned the scar on her wrist he glimpsed one evening when her sleeve slipped. Whatever she carried, it was hers to reveal or not. They developed a language of glances and gestures. She'd set the stew pot near the edge of the stove when it was nearly done. He'd stir it without a word. He'd leave the better-cut portions of meat in her bowl. She'd leave the strongest coffee for him. There was no need to say thank you anymore. It was understood. One morning, the air sharp as broken glass, Clara found the old trap Eli hadn't touched in years. It was rusted, half buried near the creek. She brought it in without a word, set it on the workbench, and began oiling the hinges. "You ever trapped before?" he asked, surprising himself. She nodded, wiping her hands on a cloth. "My father did, made me learn early." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes were somewhere far away. They laid the first line together, silent but sure. She moved with knowledge, not pride. He saw the same in her that he recognized in himself, a survivor's grace, unadorned but exact. When they returned that evening, cheeks wind-burned and boots soaked through, there were no words needed. The fire was enough. The presence was enough. One night, the silence broke. They sat at the table, a slow meal of beans and cornbread between them. The fire snapped behind her, throwing light across the soft plains of her face. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "He used to say I was a bird in a storm, pretty to watch, useless to keep." Eli didn't ask who he was. "Thought I could change the weather," she added, her voice brittle as frost on the window pane. Eli set down his fork. "Birds don't change the storm," he said. "They survive it." Clara looked up then. Her eyes were hollowed by things she hadn't said, but something shifted in them, not trust, not yet, but recognition. The storm outside wailed against the windows, a reminder of all they'd lost. Inside, two people who'd stopped believing in shelter were beginning to build it anyway, not with words, not with promises, but with presence, with quiet, with the daily, stubborn choice to stay. By late January, the land had gone pale and still. Even the evergreens seemed to hush beneath the weight of so much snow. The creek that bordered Eli's pasture was frozen in place, a ribbon of ice twisted between the cottonwoods. Clara had taken to walking there in the late afternoons, boots crunching over the crusted white. She never said where she was going, and Eli never asked. One evening, she returned with a hawk feather tucked behind her ear. He didn't comment on it, just watched as she moved through the cabin, light-footed, her presence as steady as the ticking clock on the mantel. The days no longer felt separate. There was a rhythm now, one that neither of them had set, but both had fallen into. Eli spent more time at the forge, not because anything needed mending, but because Clara had started joining him. She'd sit on the old stool near the door, winding spare thread around a spool or sharpening traps with an edge more precise than any man he'd known. Her hands were always busy, her eyes always watching. One morning, she brought him a strip of leather and a bundle of rabbit pelts she'd cured without saying a word. By sundown, they had a new pair of mittens between them, stitched in silence. He started leaving the door to the barn unlatched. It was a small thing, but she noticed. The next time she went to feed Juniper, she brought a pocketful of oats and stayed longer, brushing the mare's flank with slow, patient strokes. Eli watched from the porch, unsure whether he was more startled by the softness in Clara or the ache in his own chest it stirred. Then came the day she didn't come back from the creek. Dusk settled heavy and blue across the snowfields, and still she hadn't returned. Eli lit the lantern early, the flame trembling in the glass. He paced the floor twice, then grabbed his coat, his rifle, and a length of rope. The cold outside bit through his layers like teeth, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the hole her absence carved through the air. He found her near the old bent pine, curled on her side, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. She wasn't hurt, just still. Her face was turned toward the sky, lashes dusted in frost, and for one brief second, Eli's breath left him. Then she blinked. "I'm fine," she said before he could speak. "Just needed to feel something that wasn't walls." He didn't answer, just reached down and helped her to her feet. She didn't fight him, didn't flinch when his hand closed around hers. That startled him more than anything. They walked back in silence, the rope trailing behind him, unused. Inside, she sat by the fire, her boots thawing. Her eyes were glassy, not from cold but from something older, something that wouldn't name itself. Eli poured her coffee, added a dash of sugar from the back shelf she hadn't yet discovered. When he set it beside her, her fingers brushed his. They were warm now. Later, as the fire sank low and shadows returned to the corners of the room, Clara spoke again. Her voice was soft, like something tested. "I never had a place that felt, not safe exactly, just not watching me." Eli said nothing. He didn't know how to name what he felt, only that when she sat across from him, the cabin no longer felt like a cave. It felt like a harbor. They began to speak more after that. Not stories, not confessions, just pieces. She told him about a dog she once had, a collie named Bristle who followed her from town to town. He told her about his daughter, Lily, and the way she used to collect river stones and name them like pets. Neither said the names of those who hurt them, but the silence between their words softened, like snow melting in a cupped hand. One night Clara pulled a small book from her satchel. It was leather-bound, its corners worn smooth. She opened it not to read but to show. Inside were pressed flowers, brittle and faded, bluebells, prairie smoke, one wild rose. "From places I thought I might stay," she said. Eli touched the edge of the page, careful not to tear the paper. "You never stayed." Her eyes held his. "No one ever asked me to." He didn't say the words, not then, but in his chest something long dormant stirred like spring beneath the ice. He left the lantern burning that night just a little longer. By the time the thaw began, Clara had taken to carving small birds from leftover pine blocks. She'd leave them in odd places, perched atop the mantel, nestled beside the wash basin, tucked into the crook of Eli's workbench. They were rough but tenderly shaped, their wings curled as if catching some wind only she could see. He never asked about them, but he noticed each one, like markers on a road he hadn't known he was traveling. The snow began to recede in March, drawing back from the edges of the pasture like a tide. The creek sang again, and the air took on the scent of cold earth waking. Eli found Clara sitting by the bank one morning, her hands muddy, sleeves pushed to her elbows. She was building a cairn, stacking flat stones with a steadiness that felt sacred. "For Lily?" she asked without turning. He nodded, "and for Bristle." She smiled faintly, "and a few others." That night the wind shifted. It no longer sounded like a stranger rattling the eaves. It sounded like something leaving. The next morning, a man rode into the clearing. His horse was black, lathered at the flanks from hard travel. He wore a gray duster, his face lined deep with weather and want. Clara saw him first from the kitchen window. Eli felt her stillness before he turned. Her body went tight, like wire strung too long, too hard. She didn't speak his name, but Eli didn't need one. The man dismounted slow, like someone sure of his welcome. He tipped his hat toward the cabin. "Looking for someone," he called. "Heard she might have come this way. Girl with a mouth like a switchblade and a temper to match." Clara's hand went to the satchel where she'd kept that carving knife, though it wasn't there now. Eli stepped onto the porch. "She's not here," he said, voice flat as the plane. "Just me and my land." The man squinted. "That right? Shame. She owes me. Bit of property ran off with some coin and a few things that didn't belong to her." Eli stared him down. "Seems you mistook a person for a purse." For a moment there was no sound but the creak of the saddle as the horse shifted. Then the man laughed, low and ugly. "Well," he said, "if you see her, tell her I'm still collectin'." He turned, mounted, and rode off without a backward glance. Eli stood there long after the dust settled. Inside, Clara hadn't moved. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her face pale but dry. "You don't have to explain," he said. "I do," she answered, voice barely a breath, "because if I don't now, I never will." And so she did. She told him of a man who'd found her too young and too alone, who dressed his cruelty in flattery and his leash in lace. Of nights locked in silence, bruises hidden beneath high collars, coins slipped into her pocket so she wouldn't dare run too far. Of a house with no windows that opened, and a life that wasn't a life at all. Eli listened, not with judgment, not with pity, just with the patience of someone who'd buried his own heart once and knew the cost of digging it back up. When she finished, the fire had gone low. She was sitting on the floor, knees pulled tight, the satchel at her side. "I didn't take anything but what was already mine," she said, "and that wild rose." Eli crouched beside her. "Then you didn't run," he said, "you reclaimed." That night she placed a carved sparrow on the windowsill. Its wings were outstretched, its beak pointed east. Eli didn't touch it, but when the morning came, it was gone. In its place the satchel sat open. Inside, only the book of pressed flowers remained. Spring came hard and fast to the plains that year, as if the land had grown impatient with stillness. The snow vanished in sheets, bearing sodden earth and fallen limbs. Wild geese returned overhead in ragged formation, their cries trailing like threads in the sky. The rhythm of thaw brought with it chores too long postponed, fence posts to set, a roof to mend, new seedlings to coax from the cold, cracked ground. Clara stayed. Not because he asked her to, not because she owed him anything. She stayed like a tree finds its footing, slow, deep, quiet. She took to the garden without being told, turning soil with her bare hands, planting onions and potatoes in neat rows. She'd hum sometimes when she worked, not songs with names, just melodies, half-remembered and half-made. Eli found himself waiting for those sounds. One morning he brought her a packet of seeds from town, tomatoes, corn, a few flowers she hadn't named aloud. She looked at them long, then met his eyes. "You don't plant what you don't expect to keep," she said. He didn't argue. Instead, he helped her tuck each one into the earth. The black horse returned in late April, riderless. It wandered into the clearing slow and aimless, ribs showing, hooves caked in blood and dust. Clara stepped from the barn when she heard the snort, the brush of branches cracking beneath its weight. Eli followed. They approached together. She laid a hand against the horse's flank. It didn't flinch. A saddle still clung to its back, twisted and empty. She examined it once, eyes flat, mouth set. Then she loosened the girth and let the leather drop. "Storm'll take what it wants," she said, her voice distant. "Always does." They never saw the man again. No one came looking. Life didn't leap forward so much as unspool, slow and stubborn. The wildflowers bloomed around the fence posts. The creek ran clear. Clara began to laugh more, though never loud, just small bursts like the first breath after a long silence. Eli found himself speaking aloud at night, not just to fill the air, but because she was there to listen. One evening they sat side by side on the porch, her legs tucked beneath her, his boot tapping a quiet rhythm against the wood. "I used to think shelter was a thing with walls," she said. "And now?" he asked. She looked out over the land, the last light catching in her hair like a crown spun from dusk. "Now I think it's the place where someone waits, even when they don't know what for." He didn't answer, just reached over, took her hand in his and rested it there between them, not pulling, not holding, just there. That night, for the first time, she climbed into the bed beside his. Not for warmth, not for comfort, but because the long run was over and she was tired of sleeping like she might be leaving. Years later, folks would still pass by the old Thatcher place, though most didn't know it by that name anymore. They'd see the garden grown wild, the smoke curling from the chimney, the wind chimes Clara made from broken tools and polished bones. Some said the woman who lived there had once been on the run. Some said the man had lost everything before he found her. But those who stayed for supper, who saw the way they moved around one another, quiet, easy, certain, knew better. They weren't survivors, not anymore. They were two lives stitched together by long winter silence, by acts of daily grace, by the shelter only love, real and earned, could offer. No names carved in stone, no grand vows. Just presence, just choice. Just home,